This next demonstration is to show you stay stitching. So stay stitching is something that you would do before constructing your garment. So before you run something through a serger and before you begin assembly. So after you've cut your pieces of fabric, you would want to stay stitch curves so that they don't stretch out on you as you serge or put things together. So usually your stay stitch is through this single layer of fabric. So if this were a little mini bodice top piece here, and I had a curved neckline or a V-neck that I wanted to maintain the shape of, and if I have these arm's eyes that are also curves, I could stay stitch them. It's also commonly used in sleeves and other things that have curves as well. So watch out for directions as to stay stitching and don't skip that step because you don't want your fabrics to stretch out on you as you're putting them together. So this should happen just inside your stitch line. So if my seam allowance were a 1/2 inch, I would want to do this a little shallower than a 1/2 inch. So on the industrial machine, I only have 1/4 inches marked. So I can actually put a little piece of tape to help divide my lines, or I can, eyeball it as close as possible so that I'm really putting this stitch at about 3/8 of an inch. So just inside that stitch line. And this means that I won't have to go back later and take this stitch out. If I were to do it right on my stitching line, I may or may not see a little of it once I start to assemble that garment, and I don't want to do that. You'll also notice that I pre-marked my piece here, and you don't necessarily have to pre-mark yours, but you would want to pay attention to pattern directions as far as what direction that stay stitching goes. And typically, your garment is going to mirror each other. So in a curve like a neckline, you're often going to work from the top in towards the center. Same thing with like a V neckline. And then on your arm's eyes, you would want to work in one direction and the same on the opposite side. And that is to maintain the shape and to make sure that if any accidental stretching occurs, that we're sort of evenly distributing that and that we're not pulling it one way on one side of the garment and the opposite way on the other side of the garment. That could lead to some strange things, especially in delicate fabrics. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my machine. And again, this is not a construction stitch. This is a stitch to be done before you put things together. And if I'm lining it up at 1/8 of an inch, you can see how I'm sort of in between my 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch lines. And then I'm just going to keep an eye on the direction that I'm stitching as I go, because again, I want to be gentle. I'm not stretching out my fabric as I go. This will help maintain that shape so that I could run it through the serger or put things together without stretching it way out of whack. From the neckline, I'm going to change up the direction that I'm stitching. So this may be a little bit more difficult if you don't have a guideline here to follow. If that challenges you, you could always flip it so that you're still stitching from the correct direction, but you have your guidelines. I'm going to stop at the neckline center and then switch directions so that I'm pushing any wonkiness towards the middle and not stretching the neckline all in one direction. And this wanted to gather itself, which you don't want it to do, so kind of smooth that back out. And the reason why we do this on curves is because this is the bias, right, where my curve happens, and so I'm maintaining that bias and keeping it from stretching out. And then I'll do one more stitch to show you the opposite side of the arm side. And again, if that's hard to do because of where the guidelines are, flip the garment over. And that, once it's all done, is stay stitching. So this is a precursor to serging or putting anything together, maintaining my curves.